Hi, everybody. Welcome to the first little, what I'm calling mini lecture for the lymphatic system. What I'm going to be doing is just doing short little, maybe 5, 10, 15-minute videos on kind of the more complicated concepts of these chapters instead of sitting and doing a whole hour, hour and a half lecture in one sitting. That's a little bit too much. So the first topic I'm going to cover are lymphocytes. So there's a section in the notes and in the textbook talking specifically about the different types of lymphocytes. So I'm going to spend a few slides doing that. And this is the PowerPoint presentation that you have access to on Blackboard and going along with the lecture notes as well. So we're going to start with taking a look at lymphocytes. I've got my notes here to kind of follow along. So if you remember back in 232, when we were talking about blood, we had our 5 different types of white blood cells, right? So we had our neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils, monocytes, and lymphocytes. So what we're doing for this chapter is just honing in specifically on those lymphocytes. So those were the the round ones with the nucleus that took up most of the space of the cell. So that's how we identified that under the microscope. So think about those. We are now going to break those up into different categories within that group of lymphocytes. We're going to talk about T cells, B cells, and natural killer cells. On this slide, I have the macrophages. Those are just not technically considered white blood cells, but they do play a role in some of our defense, which we'll take a look at when we get to the non-specific defenses. So when we take a look at these lymphocytes, T cells, B cells, and natural killer cells, we're going to kind of go through the characteristics of each one. So T cells are the cells that are involved in what we call cell-mediated immunity. And there's a couple different types of T cells. We have what are called cytotoxic T cells, helper T cells, and regulatory T cells. So when we get in deeper into specific immunity, we'll see those a little bit more detail. And then we have B cells. B cells are the regulators of what we call humoral or antibody-mediated immunity, and their job is to make antibodies. And both of those T cells and B cells are responsible for specific immunity or adaptive immunity. When we take a look at natural killer cells, these are the ones that are part of our non-specific or innate defenses, and they also have a pretty cool job of destroying infected cells. So for right now, just some characteristics. We talk about T cells, looking at my notes here. T cells are about 80% of circulating lymphocytes. And then your B cells are about 10 to 15%, and natural killer cells are about 5 to 10%. So most of the lymphocytes that we have circulating in our blood are of the T cell kind, with smaller percentages of B cells and natural killer cells. All right, so I have a little comic here just to show you that if you are thinking about a way to compartmentalize these two, B cells attack invaders outside of cells. That's because they produce antibodies. Antibodies are flowing around in your fluids. If we are talking about T cells, they are going to be attacking infected cells. They do a direct cell attack with those infected cells. Okay. So, all right. So then here's just a table kind of breaking down all of those different types of lymphocytes. So here in the blue box, we see T cells. Like I said, about 80% of circulating lymphocytes are T cells with these different categories. So we have our cytotoxic T cells. These are the ones that can directly destroy an infected cell, whether it's infected by a virus or bacteria. Any cell that's been infected, cytotoxic T cells will directly kill those. Helper T cells are more of the managers, the bosses that tell other immune cells what to do. And then we have suppressor, or I think the textbook is now calling these regulatory T cells. Their job is to, towards the end of the infection, they kind of send out signals to decrease T cell and B cell activity. So that's why they used to be called suppressor, but now I think they're being called regulatory. So either one of those. And then any of these T cells, cytotoxic, helper, and suppressor T cells, all have the ability to make a memory cell. A memory cell is just a cell that has the same recognition characteristics that stays kind of hanging out behind the scenes during an infection and is ready to become active at the next exposure to that particular antigen. All right, so those are different types of T cells. And then for the B cells, they make up about 10 to 15% of circulating lymphocytes. And then when they become active, they form what are called plasma cells. That's a bad underline. Plasma cells. And it is those plasma cells that are responsible for making antibodies. And I also want to note that's not pictured here, B cells can also make, I'll put it up this way, they can also make memory cells. So it's not just T cells. And so I wanted to clear that up because the picture is a little bit misleading and it looks like only memory cells are of one type. You can have memory cytotoxic Ts, memory helper Ts, memory regulatory Ts, and memory B cells. So memory cells are part of all types of these lymphocytes. All right, and then our last group are the natural killer cells, about 5 to 10% of our lymphocytes, and their job is more closely related to non-specific or innate defenses. I'll talk about that in another one of these mini lectures. All right, so those are different types of lymphocytes, and we will get into deeper into the roles and the jobs of each one of these different types of cells as we progress through this chapter. All right, the last slide that I want to cover in this little mini lesson is lymphocyte production. You can flip back to chapter 19 to look at that hemocytoblasts and hemopoiesis, which is the production of all types of formed elements, to kind of see where this fits in. But this diagram focuses just on lymphocyte production. So if you remember, we had our multipotent hemopoietic stem cell, which we called the hemocytoblast, back in chapter 19. So when that is activated, it's going to start going through and producing those lymphoid stem cells. So if you remember, the hemocytoblast made the myeloid stem cells and the lymphoid stem cells. Myeloid made everything else, and lymphoid was just for lymphocytes. So that's kind of what we're tracking here. So we have, once that so the lymphoid stem cells are produced, they kind of break up into different groupings. So one grouping we can see follows this blood path and makes its way to the thymus. So these lymphocytes that migrate to the thymus and get programmed by these thymic hormones, they are called T cells. Okay, so that's why they're called T cells, is because they're programmed and matured, if you will, in the thymus. So they will just kind of hang out in the thymus, or sometimes they will go into the bloodstream to go fight an infection. Okay, and when they fight, they do what we call cell-mediated immunity. And so that's the direct cell attack that I mentioned earlier. And so we'll destroy those infected cells. Okay, so those are T cells. The other group of those lymphoid stem cells that are coming from the hemocytoblast, we will have some group go into the bone marrow or stay in the bone marrow. Okay. So that's why they're called B cells, is B stands for bone marrow, T stands for thymus. So the B cells stay in the bone marrow, and then they mature, they get programmed for what they need to do. And then when they go into the bloodstream, they will go and mount an attack via what's called antibody-mediated immunity, because what they do is they make antibodies. So the B cells, when they become active, will produce antibodies. And again, we're going to see that process a little bit later. That third group, so this other group of lymphocytes, the natural killer cells, these guys also mature in the bone marrow. They go into the blood supply, and then they do what's called immunological surveillance or immune surveillance. These are natural killer cells, and they are part of what we call an innate or non-specific defenses, and I'll cover those in the next little mini lesson. So they also do direct cell attack, but what makes them different than the T cell is they will attack any abnormal cell. That's the non-specific part of it, where T cells will only attack cells that are infected with something that they're programmed to recognize. So that makes natural killer cells a little bit more of a generalist, and T cells and B cells more specific to who their target is. All right, so that's our little discussion on the lymphocytes. So we have T cells made in the bone marrow, programmed in the thymus, regulate cell-mediated immunity by targeted cell attack. We have B cells, which are made in the bone marrow, stay in the bone marrow for programming. When they become active, they produce antibodies to do the antibody-mediated immunity. And then our third group is natural killer cells. They are made in the bone marrow, mature in the bone marrow, and they do immunological surveillance, which will do a generalist type of attacking and destroying infected cells or cancer. Cancer cells or virally infected cells, kind of their target. All right, so that is it for this little mini lesson. I'll come back and see you again for another topic.